I've been thinking some more about objects and the idea that knowledge often functions in relation to a metaphor which draws on objects. So we do occasionally talk about objective knowledge, or we talk about knowledge being objective when it aspires to the condition of an object. So although I think I've talked about this before, I'm just revisiting that idea, see if I've got it right in my mind at least, which is, if knowledge functions conceptually kind of like an object, by which I mean it draws upon the understanding of objects for its conceptual status, that requires us to understand how we conceptualize objects, because I don't think they're as simple as they're sometimes meant to be. I don't think they're as understood in quite such a simple way. And one of the things I'm thinking about again is to do with prototypicality. Prototypicality is a method of categorization which stands against classical methods of categorization as a means by which we break up the experiences of the world into organized logical categories. Classical categorization depends on something like necessary and sufficient conditions. So you set up a definition and then you judge experiences from the world against that definition. So here my dog Phoebe, if I set up a category defined as four-legged animals which of a species Canis or something like that, I can take the dog, I can look at it and say, does it match this criteria? And if it does, I can say, yes, it fits in the category of dogs. That's classical categorization. Categorization based on prototypicality, on the other hand, doesn't work in quite that way. It works from experience. So my experience of being familiar with this dog, Phoebe, and my experience of being with that dog, Guy, and all the other dogs, forms a kind of abstract category of dog in my mind, a kind of fuzzy trace, a gist, an abstraction, which I don't necessarily have a definition for, but it becomes a kind of central prototype against which I can judge different experiences. So if I meet another four-legged animal with fur and a long nose, I can compare it to this internal gist, this abstract, this prototype, and say, oh yes, that's a dog. So that's prototypicality. A big difference between prototypical categorizations and classical categorizations is that whereas classical categories tend to have well-defined borders, they're effectively bounded by the terms of the criteria articulating the necessary and sufficient conditions. Prototypical categories aren't like that, they're radial. So if you take a category of, let's use dogs, let's use something else. There's a category of furniture, for example. There might be a classical definition of what furniture consists of. But if I was to use a prototypical category, that would be more likely, because of course there's lots of objects that I've got in my house which aren't quite furniture, aren't necessarily quite anything else. They might be ornaments, or they might be artworks, or they might be something else. So it isn't a well-defined set in that regard. It's a kind of fuzzy set, or it's a set with blurred edges in which one prototypically organized category blurs imperceptibly into others. Okay, so prototypicality. Does that apply to the category of objects as a term? I would suggest it probably does. Certainly some things are more easily recognized as objects than others. I'm not sure if I'd call my dog an object. It seems to have properties which aren't object-like. It seems to have intentionality of some sort, I guess. I'm not even sure I'd call the path that I'm walking on an object, although it clearly is. It's a noun and those sort of things. Although I would call a rock an object. Would I call a cloud an object? Well, I might do if I was at a distance from it and I could see it and it was separate from its context in a sort of figure ground way. But if I was in a cloud, in an aeroplane, I'm not sure if I would call it an object. Is a tree an object? Well, kind of, but then are the leaves themselves on that tree separate objects, or are they part of the same object? So I think what we're starting to get there, as illustrated by those examples, is a variation in extent to which we think of objects as prototypical objects. And there probably are prototypical features. I know, is it Paul Stockwell? Something like that. In his book called Cognitive Poetics, he cites a number of features of objects coming out of Gestalt, really. And they are things like separateness from surroundings, better illuminated, these kind of things. And there seem to be marks of prototypicality. And certainly some of the things that have sprung to my mind in terms of marking what a prototypical object is, as opposed to some of the limit cases that I've mentioned, or some of the slightly more radial cases that I've mentioned. A prototypical object might be, well, it might certainly be separate from its surroundings in the way that a rock is separate from the ground on which it sits. It might be permanent and unchanging. It's something that's constantly changing its form. I'm not sure if I'd be entirely happy about that as a prototypical object, but something that is permanent, again, like a rock, shows prototypicality. Also, resistance to change, resistance to malleability, is something that's constantly changing shape, as well as changing in other aspects. Again, that would detract from its prototypicality. So something that's constant and solid, if you like. I think solidity is part of that also, actually. And perhaps also, there's something to do with weight, I think. I mean, something solid also tends to be something heavy. Now, I know I'm drawing on rocks here quite clearly, but something that's weighty, that's less likely to move. Things that don't move tend to be heavy. So there's something about weight, I think, in the prototypicality of objects. Certainly in my mind, when I'm just running through examples in my mind, a helium balloon feels less like an object when I'm thinking about it than a rock, even though they're both clearly bounded and so on. Okay, so there's a few examples there, and I'm just taking off the top of my head, but it seems to be that there's a few properties that prototypical objects might be thought of as displaying, which I guess mark the kind of centre of this radial category, and to do with weight, to do with solidity, to do with permanence, to do with unchangingness, to do with solidity, to do with clear boundaries. And the other examples that I've mentioned, like trees and clouds and dogs and so on, maybe slightly peripheral to that, so it's like further out on the spokes of that radial category. So applied to knowledge, it seems quite likely that that understanding of the category of objects is going to be what's taken across as used in a metaphor for what a knowledge object is, even though when we use this word objectivity, and we think we're being objective about this piece of knowledge, or we say this piece of knowledge is objective, we assume that it's a prototypical object that we're metaphorically suggesting. In other words, we're sort of suggesting that this piece of knowledge is solid, permanent, fixed, heavy, in the sense that it's not going anywhere, could perhaps be used as the foundations of a structure, fundamental in that sense. I think we try to attribute objective knowledge with those qualities, but I think when we do that, we're also missing the fact that objectivity, drawing on the notion of the object as a metaphor, is not only its prototypical forms, it also has these, the possibility of these radial properties also.